visit, give us a call. We do tours of not just the archive, but also of the fabulous Hutchins Institute and its great collection. Speaking of that, and I'm saying it that way, of course, because the great collector is also here today, this evening. And I'd like to welcome Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Yeah, he never knew that hip-hop would get him this far.
You don't have to be a weatherman to see which way the wind's blowing.
It's a real joy to introduce this panel, and it's a joy for many reasons. One, in looking over their work, their bios, the kinds of collaboration and the building that they've been doing in terms of really making the community of artists, creatives, designers, just everyone who wants to do this kind of work, to make that community one that is open and works with each other and really develops and helps grow and has started penetrating that world that sees the future, sees design, sees the whole technical world as not within the world of people of color, when in fact it's often at the center of our world. So I want to thank you, and it's been just wonderful, as I said. So I'm maybe a little too inspired as you hear the beginning of my introduction. One other person I do want to introduce you to is Harry Allen. He's also the It's been a great year. To start by just saying, in the book, Speculative Everything, Design, Fiction, and Social Dreaming, by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Robbie, the authors begin with the Frederick Jameson quote, that it is now easier for us to imagine the end of the world than an alternative to capitalism. And I just want to say, easier for who? Who are you talking to? In 1968, Nikki Giovanni started a poem named Dreams with, in my younger years before I learned black people aren't supposed to dream, I wanted to be, and then she begins. Clearly, they never heard Biggie say it was all a dream, or Lauryn Hill crooning, if I ruled the world, as Nas kept saying, imagine that. Wow. In our history in this country, everything has happened. We have had slave ships and pyramids on Earth and Mars, migrations, exodus, lynching, and lies, badass, crazy black people who we love. We've done everything to survive and thrive in spite of enslavement, the Middle Passage, the lies, betrayals, and living with and understanding, living in a complex world that can save you, celebrate you, and betray you. So that our dreams need to be in defiance, because the difference between us is we actually know when we're lying. We know when we're lying. We got the music, poems, songs, stories, novels, love, family, hip-hop, spoken word in our hearts, souls, and minds. More than imagine, we create and construct worlds and scenarios, and dismantle and create roadblocks that we work to overcome. And we dream of love and get involved in the whirlwind of speculation, manipulation, and work as we grow dreams, memories, and desires. So our creativity thrives. It is our proof, comment about, and commitment to living. Recently, in a talk on this campus in the fall, Cornel West called Trump gangster, or rather his quote, Trump is a gangster in character and a neo-fascist in content. And then he says, I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and now I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. So I know what I'm talking about. Thus, according to West, to call somebody a gangster is not a subjective expression. It is an objective description of somebody who does not accept the so-called constraints, does not believe boundaries cannot be crossed, believes they can use their creativity and turn it into powerful tales and worlds that shed light and set us free. He confesses, I got gangster proclivities. Tonight, this panel got gangster proclivities too. Troublemakers all. They're translating, contemplating, and speculating throughout our worlds, future worlds, past worlds, life in general. I want to introduce you to the panel starting at This end, Ronaldo Anderson. He's associate professor of communications and chair of humanities department at the Harris Stowe State University in St. Louis, Missouri. Executive director and co-founder of the Black Speculative Arts Movement. He is the co-editor of the book Afrofuturism 2.0, The Rise of Astro Blackness, editor of the forthcoming volume, The Black Speculative Art Movement, Black Futurity, Art plus Design, to be released in 2017. So I'm doing very short bios. Hopefully people can talk about more of the work that they're doing now. Susanna Morris is associate professor of Black Media Studies at Chicago at Georgia. She's author of Close Kin and Distant Relatives, co-editor for the recently published anthology, I don't know how to say this, Cigarettes, Daughters, composed of 28 dark stories and 14 poems written by African American women writers. She's currently at work on a book-length exploration of Black women, Afrofuturism, and feminism. She's also a founding member and contributing writer for the popular feminist blog, the Crunk Feminist Collective. Next is John Jennings, who we all know, and great guy. I mean, he's just such a great collaborator, and it's been more than, quite a wonderful aspect. And then next to him is Stacey Robinson.
I draw pictures.
Just that. He's assistant professor of graphic design and illustration at University of Illinois. Is an Arthur Schomburg Fellow, completed his MFA at Buffalo. His work discusses ideas of Black utopias as spaces of peace away from colonial influence by considering Black affluent self-sustaining communities, Black protest movements, and the arts movement that documented them. As part of the collaborative team Black Kirby with artist John Jennings, he creates graphic novels, gallery exhibitions, and lectures that deconstruct the work of artist Jack Kirby to reimagine Black resistance spaces inspired by hip-hop, religion, the arts, and sciences. Kenitra Brooks.
Hey.
Assistant professor of African American Afro-Caribbean literature at We've also had on red patent She's co-editor of the recently published anthology Cigarettes, Daughters, composed of 28 dark stories and poems. Her upcoming monograph, Searching for Cigarettes, Black Women Haunting Contemporary Horror, is a search and rescue mission that aims to find Black women in contemporary horror and critique the complex ways in which they manifest as characters, as creators, and as rebels to the conventions of both horror theory and Black feminist literary theory. It is set to be released later this year. Our moderator for tonight, who is absolutely amazing and has got quite a job ahead of her. I've talked to her. There. Latrice Gaskins is an artist. And STEAM Lab Program Director at Boston Arts Academy. She received her BFA in Computer Graphics with honors from Pratt Institute and MFA in Art and Technology from the Art Institute of Chicago. Any chance for me to say Chicago, I just... She then earned her doctorate from the Georgia Institute of Technology in 2014. The STEAM Lab at the Boston Art Academy is the first of its kind in an urban public arts high school. It's a model for techno-vernacular creativity and is an area of practice that investigates the characteristics of cultural art and technology made by underrepresented ethnic groups for their own entertainment and creative expression, and its application in STEAM learning. She's also author of Afrofuturism on Web 3.0 vernacular cartography in the book Afrofuturism 2.0. Without any further ado, I present you with our panel, Translating, Contemplating, and Speculating. in terms of Afro.
So we're going to do a round robin style, kind of informal panel, but I have given the panelists 4 areas to discuss, and then we can keep going if necessary and spin off of that. The first one, I was just thinking about this idea of Black radical imagination, and so aspects of Black speculative imagination in African diaspora and cultural production, and how that impacts your work. And you can talk about it any way you want, and so people 5-6 minutes a person, and then we'll just get into a flow, and it won't matter. I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance to talk. Okay. So if you get an elbow, it probably came from down here. Just letting you know. So anyone can start. So
I think Dr. Brooks should start because it's her birthday. I know. That's right?
Oh, yes.
See what I'm saying?
7:47. 38 years ago at 7:47 p.m.
Why are you?
Sorry, that's your
So I began the idea of the Black radical imagination by focusing on the concept and the idea of conjuring, and particularly the idea of conjuring in the Black American South and how that also intersects with Blackness in the Caribbean. So I was born and raised in New Orleans, and so to focus on how does that work as a meeting point. A lot of people think about New Orleans being owned by the French, but we were also owned by the Spanish. And when you go to the French Quarter, that's all Spanish architecture. So I work from the idea of looking at Rega de Ocha, looking at Santeria, and starting to see how these ideas manifest and are remixed in Southern religious practices, and how we keep these ideas alive in the culture, how we keep these ideas alive in the productions of the culture, and everything that we are. They have not died, and it's really about bringing these ideas and going back and hitting back to the idea of root working, of growing your own food, of these sorts of movements that are helping radicalize the idea of what is Black imagination.
So I think that Black futures are radical because they were never supposed to exist. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. Coming up metaphorically in the shadow of Emmett Till, poor and Black and male in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. I often think about literally, and it's very much Americana, I guess, but literally lying on my back on a barn, stargazing, and thinking about other spaces through the teachings of my mother and my grandmother, thinking about the folk tales and the ghost stories that were actually like being told to me by both of them, but also being introduced to science fiction and fantasy, and trying to make connections between the person that I was becoming and the space that I was growing up in, listening to the chirping of crickets and catching lightning bugs, but also drawing from myself and from my ancestral connections of that particular space to create myself. And actually, I was really thinking about this wonderful piece that's in the archive. I think it's the Huntington that Octavia Butler talks about, which she's literally writing herself into existence, and it's such an inspiration. And so I think about that notion of drawing myself into existence, or using like iconography and cartooning and mythology and comics to actually start to create these connections between all of these things, right? A lot of this notion of the Black radical imagination, of course, is influenced by Robin D.G. Kelly's book, Freedom Dreams. It's this notion of how do you move forward as a people, and how do you move forward any type of radicalization without first imagining yourself as being able to do so. So I think that we're made out of stories, and that we edit constantly. There are a lot of storytellers, very famous storytellers in the room as well. And I think that they would agree that by using like processes of like NOMO and other types of African diasporic storytelling practices, we can actually galvanize ourselves, retell those stories, and move into a really beautiful radicalized Black future. So
I would like to add a little bit to that. First of all, I'm going to answer these questions as an art maker, person who makes images, because I make images as a way of addressing these questions, right? So first thing I started to think about and write down was the Black imagination as a space of reimagining what Black is. One of the things I argue in my work is that Blackness is a response to whiteness, and Blackness has been scribed on us. And inside of an integrated space, we actually cannot define what Blackness is. We can only respond to whiteness. So when I make work that's about Black utopias, those spaces of peace are not, they don't just emerge out of just nowhere. They're actually spaces where we can start to imagine, we can start to redefine what our existence is. So for example, Black hypermasculinity, for example, is something that's scribed on us. It's a response, right? Well, what does that become in a space where we exist among ourselves to define ourselves? That's what I think about in reference to, for example, when I think about the Black radical imagination. As John said, we're in a space where we were not supposed to exist freely, right? We were never brought to this country to be free, right? The life expense of a slave was actually, many of them were 5 years, right? So we were never meant to be free in this space. So what does it mean to be Black and radical and to imagine? We were never brought here to imagine, right? So those are some of the things I think about, and I look at that as a survival mechanism, how we think about Blackness. Now, one of the things I also think about when I think about Blackness is how do we define that, right? So what does it mean to be Black? And I get that question a lot, and I'm always glad when I get that question, because that's exactly what we're supposed to think about. When you're looking at my work, what does it mean to be Black? Who's invited to the utopia, and who's not invited to the utopia? And what does that mean to be invited to a space or not to be invited to a space, right? So I think about that, and I even look at that as radically imagining, because it's not politically correct. But us being in this space is not politically correct either, right? So there's a lot that I think about in reference to making those images. But I'm just gonna
Pass it on. All right.
Hard act to follow, gosh. Okay. I think of a couple of things when I'm thinking about the Black radical imagination. One, I'm thinking about women's stories, in particular, Black women's stories. So my mother's from Jamaica, and I grew up hearing lots of different, I guess people would call them folktales. She would just be like history, stories, things that happened, right? And the line between this world and the next, or another world, was very much permeable, right? So I just grew up, and I'm a scaredy cat. So, the talk about duppies, ghosts, or jumbies, right? Oh, she must be worshiping a particular kind of jumbi, and she used to leave out food for it. And I'd be like, oh gosh, there's gonna be ancestors just coming, But sort of being empowered by that these stories, these were truths in my family. They're not like, oh, people are crazy and imagining these things. It's like, no, the line between this world and the other world it can be crossed multiple times a day, right? So thinking about that and how that is a survival mechanism, and it's also a creative impulse. And so that's something that sort of fuels a radical Black imagination. The other thing I'm really interested in is how Black women in particular envision world building. So I remember being a high schooler and having my weekly trip to the library, in which I would go and basically go to the sci-fi section and do this and just sweep everything off the shelf and put it into a bag and then come back the next week, But I was reading all this stuff about dragons and flying and the Dragons of Pern and the Zanth books and all that kind of stuff, right? And not really seeing anybody like reflecting me. And then summer of maybe, 97 or 98, 97 probably. I remember finding Julia Alvarez's work, How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, and I'd never read about any Dominican stuff, and I'm half Dominican. And I found Octavia Butler. There was a Black woman on the cover of the novel, Parable of the Sower. And she built this whole world that I could imagine. And there was a heroine who was about my age, and she had to save her family and Okay, so making the connection between the stories or the truths or the histories that my mother told me, and then understanding that there was a literary and a cultural tradition that wasn't just folk tales. And I'm using just folk tales as that's how I would have thought of it back then, because I was invited to consider that kind of stuff as, mythology and stuff that people made up and so on, and not recognizing it as sort of a viable truth and so on. So I'm interested in how Black women tell stories. I think that's part of a radical tradition. And I'm interested in Black women novelists like Butler, like N.K. Jemisin, like Nalo Hopkinson, and musicians like, say, Janelle Monáe, who have these like fully realized worlds that you can go into and inhabit, Cindy Mayweather, like all those albums, there's a story that's being told across from the EPs to the more recent editions, and how Monet is in conversation with the ladies from LaBelle and the folks from Parliament Funkadelic or Outkast or what have you. Like there are all these, conversations being had. So I'd leave it there: storytelling and world building.
Good afternoon. One of the things how I think I came to is when I think of the Black radical imagination, mine deals with empowerment and networks, struggle. My father was the first chemistry graduate from Jackson State. Back in the 60s, he was involved at a local level with voting rights, and my family knew Medgar Evers, and my father was one of the 5 finalists who was selected to integrate Ole Miss, and they chose James Meredith because he was a Korean War veteran, because I'm 4th generation military. And so that's how I kind of come at this, from struggle, migration, and movement growing up on bases. And I think I still remember where I was on the USS Blue Ridge when I first heard Public Enemy, when I'm getting ready to come out of college. And we were like, because this was during the transition from Run DMC, and all the Black Marines were like, man, what is that? And we're getting ready to come back to college. And it's during this time where, for our generation, between 87 and 95, all these new theorists, a much younger Skip Gates at that time comes out with Signifying Monkey, Leffy's book comes out, and you have all these other theories. Then Mark Derry's original iteration on what Afrofuturism comes out in this. Right. So we're coming in this period of where the Cold War's over and all this change is going on. And as graduate students, the internet pops in. And so this kind of incorporates with theory. What does this look like in terms of what we've been doing? John and I are alumni at Jackson State. He used to make the flyers for my frat parties when we were trying to organize concerts. And I said, man, where's that flyer dude at? Man, he needs to hurry up. We didn't have names for all this stuff they come down. We didn't call it street teams and all this other stuff. We were just having a good time operating across class dimensions, because the person where we normally had to negotiate to get clubs and places sometimes were the dope boys, because the older people at the time got on our nerves and tried to keep us out of certain places to have our concerts and parties. So it's like we didn't have a book to read called Theoretical whatever at the time. We just did it, Right. We just did it, and John was our flyer guy. And so these ideas, then when we talk about the internet coming on around the mid-90s, because for me the 21st century starts in 95 with the internet, the Million Man March, and some other stuff, and we're still involved with organizing. And I'm thinking, at that time, years after we finished graduate school, I revisit some ideas that kind of linger from the 90s, and John and I touched base again, and I emailed him, and we've turned it over to a person who's kind of like our informal archivist. I think the title of the email was, how about let's go to Paris next summer to test these ideas out with what later became Unveiling Visions, which some of you all saw in New York. And out of Unveiling Visions came the book project that we did, 2.0, The Rise of Astro-Blackness. And from that, writing the manifesto and starting the Black Speculative Arts movement last year, which is now, we're getting ready to go to Europe. It's already in Canada. We're getting ready to be in LA. We had a successful, and some of the people who participated are in this room. And the second volume will be out in anthology this year. And now I'm getting all these strange European emails now wanting me to come over to Europe to help them organize some stuff. And so it's fairly exciting. It's like I'm in conversation with some of my colleagues on the panel. It's like we're writing history as we're doing it now. And every 6 months there's a change to it. Like, oh my God, this shifted a little bit, so we got to kind of move this over here. And so, and I want to close out why this is so important. I was in Israel a week, was that 2 weeks or a week ago? Talking about this in Tel Aviv with the Palestinians and the Arabs, and I think Palestinians and the Israelis, and the only thing they seemed to agree on was they like black culture, Motown and hip hop, and of course I criticized them about the wall, which is where I think it was a little bit slow for me getting out of the country, which I will not elaborate on. But I mean, I kicked it in Haifa with some Detroit techno people that loved it. And so I don't know how now the Palestinians want to bring me to Ramallah to study the black speculative on the West Bank and see what's the application in Palestinian culture in terms of how they reconceive the cartography of the Middle East in terms of, because they're saying that we're not the Middle East, that we are the western end of Central Asia. And so they're reconfiguring speculatively where they fit in the political dynamic of the rest of the world rather than the old Middle East configuration. And so they're they are looking at this black American tradition of speculation. And to me, I always trace my interest, being a military person, I trace my love and stuff back to Martin Delaney, who was an explorer, a theorist, wrote speculatively, and of course Du Bois, and that's why I posted on Facebook today. It seems like I've been retracing Du Bois for the last few years, teaching in Ghana, presenting in Berlin. Now I'm at Harvard, and somebody hit me up and said, well, now you need to come to Fisk. So that's kind of where this is at the moment, in flux, and just glad to be able to join you all this evening.
Wonderful.
Can we move on to a new topic?
Okay.
Sure.
All right. So the next topic is pretty broad, but very specific to hip hop. It's remixing. But remixing in terms of what characteristics of remixing or the remix in black speculative art and the culture of the South. People are going to speak to that. And we can go around if we need to, because I think we can unpack this a little bit.
Oh, I'll start. One of the things when I think of when you pose this question to me, I think for a certain generation that came to us naturally in the 70s, I always think of it personally, having a Southern family from Mississippi, but at the same time being exposed to Japanese anime at the time through cartoons, technology at the time, because my dad was a chemist and I didn't realize that the chemical stuff he gave me, I kept trying to make stuff blow up at the time while I was playing with these soldiers and whatnot, and playing with the Atari game. Some of you all are too young to remember this game called Pong at the time. And so that's why I was thinking of how I accidentally stumbled, and plus watching the Green Hornet and all these martial arts movies that were coming out of Hong Kong at the time. And so, I mean, we didn't call it remix at the time in terms of why we were trying to blend these certain elements while we're reading Black Panther or Power Man comics at the time, but we were creating a new culture unconsciously at the time and absorbing elements of black popular culture at the time, whether it was listening to Southern-based Motown and gospel, especially the sounds out of Memphis. I still remember my dad's as the professor told me this morning, I can't remember the name, I just remember that Isaac Hayes album. It was what, Hot Butter?
Buttered Soul.
He always used to play, he used to listen to that while he drank his scotch and coke after work. And so, I mean, we're absorbing all of this growing up. But the thing is, for me, where it really became a Southern thing, where it becomes manifested, for me was when we graduated and I first heard Southern Cadillac play it with Outkast. Okay, those three albums, they come in at the mid-'90s. At the same time, the internet breaks loose. Biggie, Tupac passed away, the East Coast, West Coast dynamic being blown apart. I'm thinking the reverse migration to the South, where it's come home to the South, even though we'd heard Goody Mob and these other characters. When I first heard Outkast's first album as my first year as a graduate student, I was like, oh my God. You know, I wrote a paper for it and talked about it in class, how they borrow the elements that can be traced back to funk with Parliament, Bootsy, and then their subsequent albums, whether it's Aquemini or ATLians, where they're borrowing clearly from Sun Ra and some other elements. So that's, to me, in a big way, where this Southern expression of remix and hip-hop merged to become a global phenomenon right around the mid-'90s.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Outkast, because that's what I was thinking of specifically when you posed the question, Latrice. So I was in college really when they sort of hit it big nationally, and I just remember I went to college at Mount Holyoke, so on the other side of this fine state of Massachusetts. And so it was still very like East Coast hip hop at the parties and stuff, or on the radio. But I went to high school in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where geographically it's Southern, but culturally it's lots of different things, right? And so I had already heard of Outkast. But I remember when they sort of popped up sort of nationally, right, and everybody was on to them, just thinking of not just the music and the sound, which you've really aptly, connected to Parliament and Sun Ra and so on, but also their aesthetic too, right?
Very much so.
This non-normative masculinity in a particular kind of way. Some ways very normative, right? But particularly with Andre 3000, I mean, he would just be wearing a wig and like football equipment and then like a rap skirt. And so when we talk about like Lil Uzi Vert or Young Thug wearing periwinkle dresses and stuff, I need y'all to go to the 90s. And folks were doing, messing with masculinity in interesting ways back then too. And in the 80s and in the 70s and in the 20s. It's not no new stuff, right? But so just thinking about also like the physical representations of the South and different types of ways of being, and that being, as you said before, we're breaking free from that sort of dichotomy of that East Coast, West Coast, and the South being not this place sort of understood as like, oh, they don't really know what they're doing down there. Like it's not hip hop. Hip hop really is East Coast or it's West Coast, but like really the most transformative and interesting and cutting edge stuff being recognized as coming from the South. And now you'd be hard pressed to turn on a radio now and not hear Southern hip hop in a particular kind of way. So now folks, I think, in other traditions are taking Southern stylistic, sometimes in to interesting results, right? Say like a Iggy Azalea or something, right? Sort of miming Black womanhood in a particular kind of way, right? So there's that extreme, right? She's trying. I mean, if you hear the sound, you're like, oh, oh no. And so it has become commodified in a particular kind of way. So I think when we think of the concept of remix, right, or bricolage, it can also be a negative concept as well, right? Because folks can take from our stuff and put their own spin on it without attribution. Miley Cyrus, right? When it worked for her, it was all well and good, but now she's doing her new evolution and she's going to be pop again, or Taylor Swift or whoever else, right? So. Sorry to bring them up.
No. I think that's
a really good.
It's a downer.
Oh, no, I wanted to bring it back to sort of some of the remixing that we do, and remixing the idea of crew, remixing the idea of family. You guys talk about Outkast, and I was thinking about like the Dungeon Family and that sort of thing, because it's been so welcoming, and the idea of you can come in and you get in where you fit in and everybody help everybody else, right? Everybody's doing their thing individually, but we're all working together, and sometimes only John and Stacey are working together, and sometimes only Susanna and I are working together, but there's still, everything is still all of us, right? And that is very powerful, not just in terms of us, the crew, but also taking it back to some of the supernatural ideas of remixing the idea of family of the ancestors, and remixing the idea of it's not just us coming, it's us and all our ancestors for a couple of generations back that are doing this work as we are paying homage to them, and they are helping and guiding us in the work that we do.
Right. Crew is important.
So really quickly, I want to go back to your idea of bricolage, right? One of the things I wrote down here, I said, we can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. However, we can collage the culture real, aesthetics, and thinking to create practices that allow us to survive, right? Once again, I think about this as a visual storyteller, right? I make images to ask questions, to propose some type of answer. Right, I'm theorizing with images, right? And going back to that, thinking about how we collage culture, right? And thinking about this. So thinking about Outkast, thinking about the South, I want to go back to, how many of you have seen the show that's up where we just came from, right? We're talking about the cyber trap, right? So we're talking about this remix and this collage of a dystopian society of the South, right? Jackson, Mississippi is decimated by a horrible storm, right? And the remains of that what is taken from that, right? The remains of that is what forms this cultural society. But in this is a Black utopia. It's a dystopia. It's a dystopia, but it's the forming of a Black utopia where there's hope, right? I even argue in this space, one of the things that attracted me to the cyber trap as a narrative is the hope aspect in the dystopia, in this Black dystopia, right? We're always using remix, whether it's our religion. Black Kirby comes out of a remix.
Yeah.
We're remixing and reimagining culture. We're imagining music. We're imagining science and technology, engineering and art and math through the arts. We're taking STEM and turning it into STEAM, right? Using the art. So we're always thinking about this idea of bricolage and going back once again to the Black radical imagination, but we're always thinking about it in reference to hip hop, sampling, and remixing.
Right. Yeah, I always like the quote from Stephen Shaviro's book Connections about hip hop being a cultural hacking, right? The notion of it being like this this computer virus that wants to be sampled and wants to get into everything, right? Because I'm like, well, if you can't actually unmake the master's house with the master's tools, perhaps we should hack into the master's tools, and change the tools.
Right.
And so I think when I was at University of Illinois teaching, I started thinking about how, to a certain degree, the design educational experience that I was getting, or that I was teaching as well, was contributing to my own oppression to a certain degree. And I started to think about, where was I in this space? I started looking at the shape of an absence, and I didn't see myself being reflected in the type of design that I was creating. So I looked to hip hop and sampling and that type of cultural production as a way to rethink how I was teaching design. So I actually did this talk at the American Institute of Graphic Arts in Chicago. It was a national convention on graphic design, and I did a talk about the influence of hip hop on advertising and design, right? And there was a question in the audience, and it was this a woman from St. Louis, actually. I lost a card because she has one of those little cards, when they were really cute and you would just lose them. Remember those? And I held on to it for years, but I lost it. It was like, dang it, because I wanted to thank her many years. Because the question she asked me changed my life. And basically what she asked me was like, well, have you ever had any issues between teaching traditional modernist design and hip hop? And the answer is no. I mean, basically you code switch and you do what you need to do. But I thought, like, man, that'd be a really awesome class, to teach, right? And so I was very fortunate that Audrey Bennett was in the audience. Audrey Bennett is an African-American design researcher, and she had this book called Design Studies that she was working on. And she was like, hey, I would love for you to write a chapter in this book, right? And basically what I did is I came up with this idea around a traditional graphic design studio that utilized hip-hop as a way of thinking about it. And it was a dream class, right? And so the next semester, I actually made that dream come true, and I taught 25 students this class called Design Class. I spelled out hip-hop, I spelled class with a K, that kind of thing, remixing the language. And so in that class, we started doing some really interesting sociological experiments around sampling and remixing and its connection to visual culture. So I came up with this concept of the CJ. The idea of like seeing the things around you, thinking about the world as a collection of images and tracks to a certain degree, imagining everything around you as being something that you can actually sample as an asset, right? Using this notion of like critical post-production to look at what's around you and create resistant spaces through image making. And the students had to actually create their own hip-hop identities, right? They actually remixed themselves. That's the first thing they had to do. And so they were only called the name that they gave themselves in that class. And so we actually started creating this really, really powerful unit in the class, right? And this actually was one of the most successful courses I think I've ever taught, and I actually took it with me to the University of Buffalo. And one of the things that I think that borrows from Southern culture, when you think about growing up eating gumbo and collard greens and everything that you're mixing everything with, chitlins and what have you, right? Which is a type of hacking as well. That's chitlin hacking.
Yeah.
Taking things that you're not supposed to be, taking things that have been thrown away to survive. That idea is something that's very powerful. And so a lot of times when you're looking at the culture, it's about equivalence. This particular thing is equal to the same thing, you know, or that idea of, well, that's just you know, you ever heard somebody say that, like bricolage? Oh, well, that's just remix, or that's just that thing, you know. That's the way that Black people actually take something that's super complex, break it down to its you know, the DNA of something, and rejuxtapose it, right? Well, that's just that, right? And I love that. That's signifying, right? And so through this particular practice, I think remixing has become like part of, you know, just, it definitely is like a liberation technology. It's an extension of us, right? And you see it when we take something like Blue Hand Mojo that we're working on, and you take like film noir and mix it with hoodoo, right? Or you take like trap culture and mix it with cyberpunk, you know? Two great tastes that taste great together, that kind of idea, right? So that's I think some of these ideas, the notion of how you take technology and make it an extension of yourselves, and you hack into your own technology, the technology of race, the technology of identity, right? The technology of religion, gender, and actually start looking at cultural production as a way to, you know, distort those things to your own advantage, right? You know, we weren't supposed to be here, and we are, and that's because of these particular types of storytelling narratives that we've inherited from our ancestors. So that's how I think about remix. And honestly, after I taught that particular course, it changed the way that I think about scholarship. It changed the way that I think about how I move through the world, you know. And honestly, wouldn't be here talking about this particular issues if it wasn't for that notion of remix.
So I'm going to move into the Great Migration. People laughing, they're like, oh my goodness. And how I came to that, I met George Clinton in 2014.
Lucky.
And it was at Vanderbilt University, and it was a panel, and he was the keynote. And I was talking about the Congo Cosmogram and Parliament Funkadelic, and using terms like the water zone, the aqua zone. And then George Clinton came out and started talking about, someone was talking about, you know, aqua boogie, and they explained it in a very academic way, and I'm like, that was me, you know. He was in the back listening. And then I've been doing some collaborations with Hank Shockley around sound and visuals. And what's interesting about all that is that it kind of got me into sound. We talk about remixing things, tinkering with identity, things like that, but also there's a relationship between technology and sound. And I'm teaching AP Computer Science this year. Conversation in terms of just the idea of doing that in the art students. What they do is that the idea is to make it culturally relevant and actually to see terms that people talk about in computer science as something more relevant to them as arts makers and as young people. The one thing that came up again and again is the algorithm. The fact that it has rhythm in it is very important to remember. There's a reason for that. It is a step-by-step set of instructions, but by watching them sort of play around with this idea and what's the kinds of things they were making, visuals and animations and things that they could laser cut, and T-shirt designs and screen printing, all coming from code. Really, you could see the connections, but also that Sun Ra was really interested in algorithms. John Coltrane was really interested in this notion of algorithms. Sun Ra collaborated with a local inventor here in Boston, not in Cambridge, on something called the Outer Space Visual Communicator, or OVC. And in the 80s, they started performing around Boston. It was a very big system. You couldn't travel with it much far, so they would, Mass College of Art and Design and various other venues around the city, they would perform with this, and basically as the orchestra's playing, the visuals are responding to Sun Ra and the band. And it's not portable. At some point, technology changed, and for a long time, Bill Sebastian, who invented the system and worked with Sun Ra to improve it, kind of just sat on it and realized that with the new technology, he could do something more. So we started collaborating, and we just did a show called, we were just in a show called We Have Always Lived in the Future, where the OVC is now a virtual reality headset and system. And there are algorithms that respond to Sun Ra and 360. And so sound as an algorithm generated, we're now in a new era. I also started playing around with algorithms as it related to flight. And looking at, I wrote a piece recently that's not publication yet, but it's coming, about Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and comparing it to Kendrick Lamar's All Right music video and describing that through algorithms. And how important it is for us to break up things that terms that we may be on the outside of and make it more relevant to what we are today. You can look at a Sun Ra album cover and see algorithms. And the idea for students to be able to see that was very important. Then I found out, because now I'm doing this Prince research, and this is how it relates to the South. Prince, there's a song one of my students in the STEAM lab at Boston Arts Academy wants me to play over and over again, and that song is 777-9311. And I actually saw the student listen to it for the first time ever, had never heard it before a year ago. And now he wants me to play it all the time as he's working in the STEAM lab. He said it helps him to focus. And he really liked it. So then in that song, Prince is doing something nobody had ever done before. He's using the Lindrum, which is the first drum computer. But he's using it in a way that James A. Sneed talks about in terms of repetition in the cut as it relates to James Brown. Wow. So it's funk in the machine, funk in the computer. And so digging into that further, Prince's father was a musician, jazz musician, but they all come from Louisiana. All of his paternal and paternal all come from Louisiana, all of them. And how the Great Migration is bringing me to my next question. And the impact of the Great Migration at the time of all these folks coming from the South to places like Minneapolis and various other places in the North. The Nelsons went everywhere, Arkansas, whatever, but they also went to Minneapolis. You had this, this vital factor in the development of African American art and culture, and how it improved the lives for migrants all over the country, including in New England. And so what aspects of this movement impacted the lives of African Americans in the South? Because there's this back and forth that begins to happen. People leave behind family, and then there's the cultural exchange that begins, that happens. So I want to ask the panelists to talk to that a little bit.
Okay. You want me to go? Give me a start? Oh, you go ahead.
All right, for me, the Great Migration, I always remember this preacher saying to me once that, because our family's from Mississippi, and he said in a sermon once, he said, I'm from Yazoo, Mississippi, and Yazoo, Mississippi is a good place to be from. And my family's from around Hazelhurst, Crystal Springs, Jackson, Mississippi. But when you say Great Migration, I don't limit it to just this country. A whole bunch, when you think of migration, when it starts, the military is also part of that migration. That was the place where particularly a lot of young black men, my father, because they didn't let black people go to dental school back in the 60s in Mississippi, he joined the Air Force, becomes a captain, goes to Vietnam. That impacts his experience. And then my experience is after I'm born and living in Japan for a few years, I often think about how those experiences shape how I then come back and reorient with Black American Southern culture at the time, because I always remember it would seem like wherever we had migrated to, then there was that thing where a lot of parents, you have what they say, we're going to send you back down home. They call it down home, to kind of dip back into that traditional experience, because I remember sitting on the porch in the summer with my grandfather. I guess he didn't think I was necessarily culturally oriented enough, and his favorite group back then was the Isley Brothers and Johnny Lee Hooker.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, those were his two guys back then. And then, then we go back to wherever it's a base that I might have been living on. And I think how when I migrate out, clearly Asian culture had probably a big influence on me in terms of how I looked at Black American culture. Because what I liked about Asian culture, I remember watching this war movie where I remember the only movie John Wayne ever got killed was Sands of Iwo Jima. And so I decided to start studying Japanese culture, because those must be some bad dudes to kill John Wayne. And so when I joined the military, I studied judo, and all these other kind of things. And plus it's reading comic books, listening to this music while we're training or whatever. And so I think people always think of, well, you know, the touchy-feely side, I call it, of the Great Migration. I think military and other specs, working in factories, getting away from these agriculture, rural areas, transformed our aesthetics, that transformed our worldview. Coming from the South, and then what I would call the North, the concrete jungle, in terms of the alienation, organized crime, and all that other kind of stuff going on. But it seemed like at some point we're always sent back to the South to kind of reorient ourselves culturally into a certain type of matrix in terms of how our ethics are supposed to work and how we engage those ethics. But I would say as my migration experience is why I don't necessarily believe in the traditional Christian ethic thing of, you know, nonviolence and all these other things. I'm like, man, that don't make sense to me, you know, so because I was not culturally oriented to, you know, and that's why I remember we had this tug of war with relatives. I'm like, no, man, I can't do that, you know, because of this, because so that migration experience transforms our worldview and a lot of other cultural assumptions we had of what you can do with culture at the time, who are allies at the time, you know, and what other kind of aesthetics you might be attracted to. Traveling abroad, they didn't call this stuff hip hop. I remember in Australia when we first got there, they used to ask the Marines we got there, do you all have any of the new music? They called it new music at the time because they didn't have MTV and all this other stuff. And at that time, we didn't call it hip hop. We called it rap music, and most of the rap guys were from New York. And I was in the D.C. area. We had go-go. You know, so to me, it doesn't become hip hop until Madison Avenue gets their hands on it or whatever, tries to market it. But people have different ways of how that migration. And I learned black men as culture carriers with our mixed, all these tapes that we took with us overseas. The same way those young cats in World War I took jazz to Europe at the time, we took our music with us to all these bases around the world and introduced local populations to our music, and then incorporate some of their things into, you know, while we're training, practicing martial arts, and they're listening to our music. And so that's why you can travel anywhere over the world, because all this military presence that played these music for local populations at the time kind of inoculated them to accept Black American music. And so so when I think of Great Migration, I don't think of that Jacob Lawrence thing where we're looking like we struggling, you know, going up north. I'm thinking it even beyond the shores of this country, because we went all over the world. All over the world, you'll find second and third generation Black Americans living abroad who left 2 or 3 generations ago from the early part of the 20th century, and they're living in France now, or England, or Japan, or Australia. So the migration was not limited to North America.
I have a really challenging experience with the South. My migration, I actually was born in Albany, New York. I moved to the Bronx, lived there for 2 years. And I migrated to the South in my later 20s. I had a very different experience, a more challenging experience that is not necessarily so celebratory of the South. When I moved there, I was scared to move to the South. Literally, like the place, I moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina. The center of town was where they auctioned slaves, and it was still present there as a landmark there. I was very, very scared moving there. However, I moved there in 97. I was, later 20s. I'm trying to remember. I moved there in 97. I moved there and I expected that all the things I learned about the South in reference to revolution and that I would get an education in, right? However, what was interesting is I come from a Jehovah's Witness culture, and I had just become, at that time, I had been a Christian for a number of years, non-denominational Christian. Joining the church in the South, I had a very different experience than what I expected to have. The politics were not about revolution. They were not about protest. And I was also, that was the first time I became successful in going to school. Now, ironically, my success in my associate's degree, undergraduate degree came from the South, right? Ironically, I was successful in school there. However, the church culture there introduced me to praying for your pastor, praying for your employer for financial advancement. You pray for your employer, even though he's treating you badly, you'll advance, God will advance you. That's not, it was not mixing with the thinking that I grew up with. I was looking for Dr. King, right? I was looking for all these things I learned about revolution that actually came out of the South. And I, to be honest with you, I was living in the South for 15 years, and I say that it took me 15 years to escape the South, right? It wasn't until I actually was invited to study with John in grad school in 2013 where I moved back to New York, in Buffalo. And what was interesting is once I got out of there, I was actually able to ask some of these questions that I always had that I could not ask in the South. They didn't want to have those types of conversations that I wanted to have. Now, once again, this is my experience, right? Talking about the Great Migration to the South, right? Coming out of that, I was actually able to get around some people who could actually help me answer some of these questions, John being one of them, right? One of the questions I started to come up with is some of the things that like Jay Electronica said, right? He says, he said something along the lines of New York rappers be calling our what did he say? And I'm trying to remember it as I'm thinking about it. He said calling Southern rappers lame, but steady jacking our slang, right? And he said something along, following up with that, he said Southern rappers, something along the lines of Southern rappers taught you how to sling the record out of the back of your trunk while you were, arguing about the points in your contract, Black. Something like that, right? I'm totally jacking it up. I'm glad he's not here. So please don't butcher my rhymes, right? But I noticed that my favorite rappers, DJ Premier, is from the South. Right? Jay Electronica is from the South.
New Orleans.
Went very much so. Very much so. Went to your church. Right? So once again, I go back to the North and I'm starting to be able to look at the South with a different lens. I don't have all the answers yet. My migration to the South was not a very happy one, but in a particular way, it was a very liberating one because it gave me my foundation in my education. It gave me an exposure to prejudice in a particular way that I would not have had in the North, right? So the Great Migration for me was very different and not very celebratory, but Kenitra and I had a conversation about this.
I'm about to talk.
Yeah. And I was like, you know what, you need to say that because we have very different experiences.
Very different.
Yeah.
So I was speaking to him and he was like, going south, the idea of, Baldwin said, just looking at the map of the South can give Black man a heart attack and those sorts of things. But for me, and me coming here, Boston is my Mississippi. Boston is because it's a type of white folk I don't know. It's white ethnic. I'm always saying, I could hang out with Bubba. We eat the same food. We listen to the same music because my grandfather liked country music, so I like country music, right? So that there's a connection there, and the idea of the South being so scary is flipped for me and in my family's experience. We also talked about the idea of the Black Southern respectability that he talked about. And for me, I was saying it's another mask. My family operates within Black Southern respectability, but are incredibly radical within those spaces. And I talked about with him the hurtfulness sometimes from folks from the South that Northern Black folks, white folks can misread whatever they want, but that Northern Black folks will misread that mask and will see it as a truth and see it as an idea of lame and seeing it as an idea of, oppressed or weak and not recognizing the way, again, using that conjuring, we work in the roots, right? The root work happens underneath. right? And those things are happening, but you may not, you have to be able to read them. And if you aren't reading it, if you're not able to have that lens, which we, us Southern folk, can help it, that it's not there. And also, we were talking this morning about with the Black church, and I said, I think too much focus is going on the pulpit and that very male space that can happen. But for me, my radicalization happened in Sunday school, right? That idea of talking back, the idea of asking questions, and the idea that my Sunday school teacher was like, you ask whatever question you want, baby. We will go find it out and we will go research it if we can't get it. So that's where I say, even as the Black church produced me too, and all of my radical ideas and radical thinking about these things, so that there is that pushback and that there is that root work going on in the Black South, but it has to be able to be read.
Amen.
Right.
Could I add something just real quick? Could you, when you said white folks, the other thing you jarred my memory. I remember in the military, white people was the only thing that we gave to American white people. Because I remember we didn't call, if you were someone who looked white, but you were from some little pissant country, didn't speak English, we did not accord you the term white. They'd be like, oh, he's from some little country or whatever. And so white was associated with English speaking, because they operate in a hierarchy where at the Anglophile world is at the height of the white world. And if you're one from one of them little white countries that no one understands your language, I mean, it's like you're not even, we don't have to respect you the same way.
So
And that's how it operates in the military. I'm just like, if you're a country and we say we protect you and you got like one ship, we're your army, just be quiet and bring us our stuff, So, yeah, so that's why I said white was a term reserved for North American whites.
So we're gonna need to do Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can go on, but we
Yeah,
also
we
know
can.
you all want to talk to us, and
Yeah.
we talk to you. And Susanna's going to say something. So after Susanna says something, we're going to break out we're going to give it to the audience to ask.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the ways in which I think Black speculative culture and hip hop culture intersect in the South. So I'm obviously, from my accent, not a Southerner. I can't let go of the East Coast accent. And I'm a transplant, right? So I've been living in the South for the past 15 years between Georgia and Alabama. So urban South and small town South. And my work has been transformed by being in those particular spaces. By being in spaces where Black folk are often the center, I think has focused my own research and work. I've always been focused on Black women's writing, right, from undergraduate degree to my work, during my PhD. But being in spaces where I could go the whole day and only see Black people invited me to consider Black-centered universes in particular kinds of ways. And as someone who, I've lived in New England for college, I lived in Connecticut when I was a young child, and I lived in all Black communities then too. It also invited me to reconsider the communities that I grew up in, right? So I'm from Waterbury, Connecticut, which maybe no one, Waterbury? Okay. Wait, okay. Dirty water, okay, all right. So when you say Connecticut, people think, I don't know, Martha Stewart or something like that. But Martha hangs out with Snoop, so I don't know. But there are ways in which Black folk in the North, right, and your question, and embedded in your question, Natrice, is this notion of Black Southern culture improving life for people in the North, right? And so in Waterbury, everybody I knew who was Black was either from a very specific area of Eastern North Carolina. They all migrated to work in the Timex factory. Or like my family, from Jamaica, from Guyana, from Trinidad, from Barbados, from Montserrat, from Grenada, these little tiny places, right? And we formed a community together, and our cultural experiences were distinct, but they weren't so disparate that they didn't make sense, right? So my best friend was from Sunbury, North Carolina, and my mother is from Westmoreland, Jamaica, and there were so many cultural overlaps that it sort of made sense, right? So I think when we think about this great migration, thinking about the global South as well, right? So the ways in which our cultural roots might be in conversation. And the last thing I'll say, as someone who's lived in Atlanta off and on since 2002, I think there's no it makes a lot of sense that we have a really vibrant both hip hop community and Black speculative artistic community in Atlanta, and it's particularly Southern, right? It's rooted in these Southern cultural traditions, but also in a sort of a larger global South tradition that doesn't always get recognized in a particular kind of way, because sometimes we're focused on these Northern roots. But even if you chip at the Northern roots, there's the Southernness there as well. So.
So, Kenitra, just a second. Like when you said the thing about Boston being your Mississippi, like I completely feel that. I grew up in this.
People to pray for me on Facebook. I was like, please, I want to survive.
I grew up in this. I grew up in this place called Franklin County, Virginia. It's a little tiny little town. It was called the Moonshine Capital of the World, and there was this Klan march in 1983 when I was there. And I used to ride my bikes. I lived in this projects in this one part of town. I used to ride my bike everywhere, sit in people's apple trees and cherry trees and eat. Never afraid of anything. I moved to New England, and I'm down at Faneuil Hall, and somebody was like, "Don't go to this neighborhood. Don't go to that neighborhood. Don't go there." And people ask me. I live in New Hampshire now. They're like, "Would you ever live in the South again?" I'm like, "I love the South," but as a Black man who's in love with the South, it's kind of like being in love with a prostitute. There's just some things you don't talk about. Do you know what I mean? And so, like, when you said that, I've never. I mean,
That's a weird frame of reference. Wrap my mind around that.
Yeah. So I've never heard anybody else make that reference about this being their Mississippi, because you hear about people coming to the north, or Black people from the north going south and being afraid and like thinking about all of the other things. I'm not afraid. I do the same thing. Like, me and Bubba do eat the same food. My wife is white. We have the exact same, we have different recipes for collard, but we still eat collards. You know what I mean? So I think that just really, I don't even have a question. I just wanted to say that.
Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you all for being here. My nerd level is is going sky high. I'm glad to be around some adults. Been around kids all day. So I have a vexing question, and I'm just gonna throw it out there like a grenade, and hopefully someone will pick it up. I'm wondering if people can talk about the reconciliation between 4 categories: Black imagination, magical realism, cognitive dissonance, and then the Black mental health issue. Is that all?
That sounds like a conference.
That's a different.
That's a conference. That's a whole nother.
That's like 3 dissertations.
I'm wondering, because I'm as an artist, I'm an artist, and I practice. I'm an illustrator, and I write, and I think it's very important as I teach. I'm also a teacher. I teach at the Boston Arts Academy with Latrice. And the first thing I ask all students is, what's your vision of yourself in the future? And I know that the power of imagination is really, really important. Yeah. Then as I teach, and I've been teaching for half my life, my birthday's tomorrow. Oh. Right? So, I know, right? Hey, mom. All right, so, but the question is really, like, how do you reconcile the need for people to really activate their imagination, but along that spectrum, we see so many of our youth are trapped within a world created by their imagination, this magical thinking that they need, they use, and and hip hop is from that. Right. I'm thinking of Kanye and his kind of where he is in his life, and then I'm also thinking about like the other end of the spectrum of just mental health, like in the crisis in our community.
I'm going to start that off. One, with the magical realism, I sort of agree with Toni Morrison in that one, where she's saying we're from our own traditions, and I don't always feel Black folk or folk of the diaspora, African diaspora, claiming magical realism, right? We've always had this idea, right? We've always had it in our folklore, in our oral history, in our culture. So I like to leave, particularly coming from a HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution, I like to leave like, that's y'all thing, y'all could do that, and that's fine. But speaking and going back to the idea that you were talking about with the mental health and with the mystical world and those sorts of things, I start to ask the question of, why do people need that? because we recognize that we lost so much, and that is how we keep it and go back to it. That's how we keep to go home. So we have the idea of the South as home, but we also have our soul home, we have our ancestral home, these sorts of ideas. And that's why we are living in these other worlds, because we long recognize the falseness of the constructs of reality. That's never really been sort of an issue for us. So I think it's going back to what's already been there in a way of accessing that, or hacking, as John likes to talk about.
Ronaldo, I was thinking about you, your metaphor of summers, going home or going down home. And you talked about how it transformed you. But it also transformed your cousins, too. It was a two-way street. It's very important to remember that. Because I grew up in Piedmont, West Virginia, which is halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington, so it's eastern West Virginia. And we had the people who had migrated to Rochester to work at Kodak, or to Yonkers, New York, and then some went to Columbus. They would send their kids back, even to West Virginia, which is upper South, or lower North, or however you want to think about it, right? And they would bring dances, and they would bring, but we had TV, we had cable. Cable was actually invented for Western Maryland, Eastern West Virginia, and Western Pennsylvania. Nobody knows that. So in 1949, in Piedmont, West Virginia, they got cable. Yeah, it's going to connect rural communities. So it was a yuppie experience much later. So even people there were getting influences from New York and Washington, from where I live. But they brought all kinds of black underground cultural things, like the latest dances, and we would hear the same music, but the dance is the most important thing. And they transformed us, but we transformed them as well. So, and the other thing that was transformative, which we forget, but you probably know better than anybody in this room since you're fourth generation. My father talked about, the reason I wrote Signifying Monkey is my brother's a third generation dentist in my extended family. And did your father ever get to dental school?
No, he he retired as a university administrator at Maryland. He got his doctorate after he got out of the Air Force, and we lived in Maryland towards the end of his career.
My father talked about the transformative cultural matrix that was a segregated army. Because it brought together black people from the North, black people from the South. It didn't care. My mentor at Yale was Charles Davis, who was from an old black Virginia family, but he went to Dartmouth, class 39. Then he went to University of Chicago because Allison Davis, first black professor at a historically white research university, was his mentor. Then he went in the Army as a second lieutenant, because this is 1941. He had a master's degree, right? My father and Charles Davis were in the same unit in Petersburg, Virginia, because it was quartermaster camp, and they didn't care if you had a PhD or if you could barely read and write, you were going to be a quartermaster. And for those of you who don't know, quartermaster meant you cooked and cleaned, or were. Charles Davis was the valet to the general. Wow. That's what they did with an educated black man, right? But it was still the same scale of service. But my father came back. I was born. He's in World War II, and my brother's born in 1945, and I'm born in 1950. So by the time it was appropriate, he was telling us tales of Signifying Monkey and Shine the Titanic, and all that stuff he learned in the Army. And he said he met people who couldn't read and write, could repeat 1,000 stanzas of Shine the Titanic. And and I don't think anybody's written about it. Well, it's a dangerous thing to say nobody has, but it's a great thing for somebody to write about it. It's segregation and the Army as a space where black cultures could communicate, because there never was, never, and never make that mistake, which you all wouldn't do. There never was one black culture.
Right.
Never. And the other thing, the final thing is that when we talk about Southern and Northern black culture, even as late as 1890, if you look at the 1890 census, 90% of the African American community lived in the South. There's a special issue of the North American Review in 1884, and it's on the Negro. And what it says is there are several articles. It reads like these are by white people, right? But it reads like one or two black people. This is pre-Du Bois, of course. Right. And it's one white guy, proto-sociologist, who gives the demographics of the black community. and says, the black people are never going to move. They haven't moved since they were liberated by the 13th Amendment, he says. They didn't move during Reconstruction. And this is, Reconstruction officially ends in 1877, so this is 7 years late. He said they haven't moved yet, they're never going to move. And I predict, given their growth rate, that these states are going to be black states. You know, the same vision that Elijah Muhammad would have much later. And then, of course, we know somehow after 1890, and people mistakenly start the Great Migration in 1910 or 20. It starts in 1890. Right. The first migration novel is Paul Laurence Dunbar, Sport of the Gods, published in 1902. And he talks about black people leaving the South, going to the North, and his protagonist returns and comes back. So this theme of migration is very complicated, very old. Right. What is Southern? What is Northern? It's almost that the Northern black community is a very recent being in the history of the Negro, as Du Bois would have said, you know? Because think about that. From 1890, only 10% of the black community was living up here in the North. And then, of course, that would change dramatically, and then it would reverse starting in 1970. Right. So anyway, thank you. Great. And Latrice, great job.
Thank you.
Anybody want to comment?
I was going to respond saying you were actually right about that cultural matrix of the military. I remember it was the black Puerto Rican guys that brought their own flavor to our unit. And we learned something from the Southern guys, the Northern guys, whether it was gambling, haircuts, dance, or whatever. They were all regional influences. And when you said talking how we impact family and cousins, I remember at the same time I was in college with John when we had a protest and they were talking about bringing the people who had shot up the campus. The guy was remember we had the protest? I do. And they were talking about bringing the guy who was the sheriff who had shot back in the 60s, but this is 20 years after that at the Jackson State shooting. Right. And a lot of us were vets, well, you know, it's not going down like that. We're going to have to take him out. When we were openly talking like that, ain't going to be none of this, we shall, you know, because a lot of us were veterans or whatever. And I mean, I experienced the same thing during the Ferguson unrest when my students were out there. And I was walking around the cops. I was like, I wasn't afraid of the fat donut eating ones because, I mean, when they had the real military out, from Cold War vets up to now, we're walking in looking at, man, what we gonna do if they try to get loose? And we weren't looking at, you know, basically the praying people kind of got on our nerves about, you know, when you talk about having an impact on your family and cousins. And that thinking has always been there present in our community. We haven't always been these preaching, praying, waiting on God to do something. And that's why the important part of the Black Speculative to me is more about black empowerment. It's not dealing with assimilation or integration. It's about projecting a vision for the community, and it might have different ways of getting there. And so, but you're absolutely right about that matrix all coming together. And a lot of times we leave out the impact that the African immigrants also, what they have on our recent development in this cultural matrix.
More Africans migrated willingly to the United States between 1990 and 2000 than came in the entire history of the slave trade to the United States. And that's a fact. That is a fact. Which is astonishing when you think about it.
Seriously, I know.
Tim.
Yeah.
This is our last question for time.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay, I'll try to be very brief. I will. So, yeah, I understand all of the different backgrounds. We have people from different perspectives on the panel. But my concern, because I know a little bit about what each of you do, it's like, my concern is, or the question I have is, how is all of the work on the table, which each person is doing things individually, or they're collaborating with maybe one or two other people on the table. So we have Black Speculative Arts Movement, we have MOTHERBOXX now, which is some new idea. We have with Dr. Brooks, what is the archives, what is the thing, the digital thing? Right. My concern is, this is a question really for everybody in the room. How do you harness all of these different things, put it together into something that can not only just survive intellectually, but it can survive as a product, as a thing that people outside of the academic world, people just, folks walking down the corner will get. How do we do that, and what do you imagine that could or will be?
Go ahead, Ron.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm going to talk about the manifesto, but part of my work is with the Crunk Feminist Collective. And so when Brittany Cooper and I co-founded it in 2010, our idea was to bring together different folks, have a collective, have a crew like Krenitra brought up earlier, and to be able to share our ideas about pop culture, about hip hop, about speculative fiction, around race, gender, sexualities, all these different things with the folk, you know, and have conversations back and forth. Because it's one thing, I started my career as a Toni Morrison scholar and, you know, love Professor Morrison, but the stuff that I was writing for tenure and so on, that was not really translatable. Like, I could not take it to my mother, not because she couldn't understand the concepts, because trust, my mother's brilliant, but she doesn't have a PhD, right? And she finds that stuff boring. So I think that we have to re-envision audience, we have to re-envision dissemination, and I think all of us are doing work to that end. Part of that is utilizing digital spaces. You know, part of that is you know, if we are in an institution like the academy, which we all are in, harnessing the resources of the academy, right? I mean, this space is literally indicative of that, but wherever we are, right? So I'm at Georgia Tech in the middle of Atlanta, and I just got there, but thinking about how I can be an infiltrator. Like, that's literally how I see my role. Like, y'all messed up and gave me tenure? Okay. Can't get rid of me now. Shoulda never, can't give Negroes nothing. But in all due seriousness, thinking about whatever space of power and privilege I have and bringing other people into the space, right? So there's a couple of things. I think the democratizing space of the internet is one that I've sort of utilized along with my collective, but also using the power and privilege that I have within the academy, because it's a space that not a lot of people have access to, and I have access to it. And I'm not going to get in trouble by saying particular kinds of things the way someone who does not have tenure or who is an adjunct or a visitor might have. Welcoming folks who are not students into space, right? Because even though it's a public university, if you don't look a particular kind of way, you might get asked to leave, right? But sort of using my power in sorts of ways to bring people in, right? So that's not necessarily, I guess, an answer that gives a way to sort of undo the master's tools, right? But it's sort of my individual contribution. And I think when I'm working with other people who are on the same page, we can break particular things down. So
can we just, and we also have an idea of gatekeepers that should have never given us tenure and working together.
Right.
We now have New Sons. We have a book series, New Sons, Race, Gender, and the Speculative on Ohio State University Press, to give the platform to folks who are doing work like us. And there are flyers somewhere for it, yeah. And to give the opportunity for folks to get tenure who are more like us, who are more doing these radical, imagining the Black radical imagination, the queer radical imagination, who are having these conversations. And now we can give you the pathway to get tenure and to populate the rest of the academy with us. Remix.
So, yeah. To answer, so I spoke at Yale School of Architecture last October about the Cosmogram as an architectural, as a space and time place. A student in the audience went back to Houston, Texas, and created a portable play space based on the Cosmogram, working with youth. And so it's out in the housing development. And there's these photos, wonderful photos of children in rapping, jumping, playing, but they're all designing cosmograms that are then made into the sidewalks and into these spaces based on the talk that I gave. That, bringing it from academia to the hood, literally, through this student working with architects in Houston. Amazing.
So are you saying then that this kind of environment, the academic environment, is where your needs most?
Absolutely.
But then that is expected to be commoditized and monetized?
No, not monetized, because this is community based. It can be, but I'm saying the whole purpose of this artist, it can be. But my point there is that it went to a young person who never would step into a Yale, and is suddenly engaging African metaphysics in a sense, in a street way, doing things that people talk about in academia, but they're actually doing. So I think by inspiring artists, by inspiring people in these kinds of spaces, we then create opportunities. They can be monetized, or they can just become a community-based space for youth and others to engage in.
All right, to answer your question, that's why I wrote the Black Speculative Art Manifesto over a year and a half ago, when I was requested by one of the activists out of England to write it. And if you Google it, I see Walt sitting back there. That's what jogged my memory. I said at Princeton meeting we had a couple years ago called Ferguson is the Future. When I got to Princeton, I was still highly pissed about Ferguson. And I remember I'll never forget telling the audience, I don't love you, or whatever. And people were like, I said, I'm going to build a network around this black speculative stuff. So I wrote the manifesto first, and then I asked Maya Williams to help me start the convention aspect of this, to get the regular folks involved, because the academy is just going to follow what's ever going on the streets. So that's why, I mean, academics are welcome, but I want, just artists who like doing the work, people from the community, school teachers, barbers, or whatever. And that's how we are building the movement where regular folks, because if you just let it, if it becomes led by the academy, it'll get drowned like a baby in the bathwater. So, all the academy is good for is providing the space to have it, but they cannot lead it, even though there'll be academics involved, I guess, to make sure we write it in APA style or whatever, or MLA style. But that's why we describe it as a movement. It's international now, and we're going to keep growing it. And it's a fight on two fronts. When you say how does it become an everyday thing? First of all, we kind of got to sweep aside some of the older crowd, So there'll be an internal kind of struggle aspect of it, because all this new stuff we're doing is going to put some people out of work. Okay, in terms of not getting invited to speak because their stuff is old. All right. And then the other aspect of it is you got to deal with people that want to commodify it or get ready for the intellectual attacks that will come, and we're going to have to hurt some feelings along the way. We'll have, and I don't mind being the designated person to do that.
Obviously not.
And so, I mean, like I said, and that's why I think when we had that Ferguson is the Future, that a lot of people in the room there. I think when my student, Michael Brown's uncle was in my class that fall when Mike Brown was killed. Man, I said I'm not apologizing for anything I do going forward. If you don't like it, oh well, move on without you. And after you've had students get hit with rubber bullets or tear gas, man, you don't give a damn about some administrator's feelings or some scholar that's on some other bullshit about whether you didn't cite them or not. Because things are happening too fast or whatever to worry about some of the little social etiquette that comes along with being on. And my aspect, I have no problem running over people. Now, if you on our side, great. You can join this double Dutch thing. But if you ain't for us, man, we're not going to stop in the interest of some other stuff that's even unrelated to what we're doing. And I think that's where it's going to become a more popular item and as it starts to spread and grow. And we've been at it for about a year and a half now. And it's continuing to grow. I mean, as I told Jess, who's sitting in the crowd, man, I'm excited about all these young doctoral students. Yeah. And they're the ones that's going to be the wave that's really pushing all this stuff now. Because when we started this stuff a few years ago, man, we had a struggle finding people to cite, but now young people are actually getting jobs based on this stuff now and getting on tenure track gigs, or they're out there creating stuff based upon ideas that just showed up 2 years ago. So it's coming. That wave, that third wave that Natrice writes about is coming, because we're going to wrap up the second wave here in the next 18 months.
Really quickly?
We got to open it up. We're going to take a question?
Yes. I had the one question.
Okay, that's fine.
Really quickly?
Yeah, I know. Just a second. So you've been trying to, and
Yep.
he's been very generous
Yep.
with the mic as well.
Yep.
Quite a bit. So why don't we take this question and this question,
Yep.
and then we can respond to it, because there's.
We have 15 minutes. We have 15 minutes.
Yeah, you gotta,
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. My question kind of builds off of Stacey's research, but I wanted to get the rest of the panel to react to it on the idea of the Black utopia, but particularly women in leadership in the Black utopia. And I'm asking from the framework of looking at what Ta-Nehisi Coates and Roxane Gay have done with Marvel Comics in the last 2 years in reimagining Wakanda as a democratic society led by women. And so how does that then shape a project like you were talking about, Sycorax's Daughters? This is really expanding on what Morrison and Butler did back in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. And how do you all see yourselves kind of carrying that torch forward and being inspired by other examples that are unfolding around us?
And then the other question?
It's a question for you, John. So about the remixing idea. So, and I was looking at your work, and I saw that you were remixing parts of. Being from Haiti, I was struck by some of the images that you remixed from Vodou, and I was thinking of trying to do some reverse engineering to try to understand how you put this together. I was looking at the Bokor figure. I was looking at the Guédé-like figure. Not totally Guédé, but it made me think of Guédé. So I was actually very curious about, thinking about the South, and thinking of Haiti also as part of the South, New Orleans connection, Brazil, and other places like that. Definitely. So can you say a bit? I was very intrigued, but it's beautiful work and very stimulating. But I wanted to understand a bit more of your thinking around this remixing of Vodou and other belief systems.
Okay. Did you guys want to do the?
Two very different questions.
Yes.
The first one.
Who wants to?
Well,
Okay,
the
first
idea
one and
of-
then, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
No, go
So
ahead.
the idea of Sycorax's Daughters, which Susanna and I have been working on, and we just had it come out, is one, pushing back against this idea of what I call the absent presence of Black women in horror. This idea that Black women don't write horror or create horror. And
Are interested in horror.
Aren't interested in horror. And, we just never found that to be true. Again, it's in the folklore.
Right.
Again, it's been being produced. So how do we simultaneously, speak about the work and theorize about the work, but also making sure the work gets seen and making sure and bringing other voices into this idea and saying that we've been here and this work is here and exists and presenting it to the public. So keeping the public as a part of that. The public are the people who are the geeks. The public are the people we are a part of them.
Yeah.
Because we all got into this because we're geeks, because we like weird stuff. Black people doing weird stuff. That's why I always describe us. Go ahead.
And there's tons of us,
Yes.
right? So I live in Atlanta, and when I go to the movies and I go watch, Captain America: Civil War, and I go to my neighborhood movie theater, it is packed, and I'm sitting next to folks, and I can hear the brother behind me. Okay, so that guy, he is the Black Panther. He is the king of Wakanda. Yeah, so in the next movie, there's going to be a movie next year. I look back, I don't know who he is, but he knew everything about all the comic book stuff. Every time I go to a superhero movie, it's filled with Black folk who are probably of all sorts of educational levels, certainly all age levels, So I think I want to piggyback on that. What I'll say to your question, Walter, about Black women and leadership and so on. So, I completely agree with what Kenitra said. We're collaborators, we're co-conspirators in many things and taking over the world. But thinking about, gatekeeping in these progressive ways, we probably need to come up with a better term than gatekeeping, something more feminist. Speaking of feminism, that's the root of all the work that I do. So as Professor Morgan mentioned earlier, I'm working on a book right now that I've tentatively entitled Electric Ladies. So shout out to Janelle Monáe, Black women, feminism, and Afrofuturism. And so I've been thinking for the past few years in publishing on the intersection of Afrofuturism and feminism, and I've identified a few sort of key aspects across literature, fashion, music, art, right? So I'm looking at Butler, I'm looking at Wangechi Mutu, I'm looking at lots of different folks, and thinking about some key aspects. So one is the remix, which we mentioned earlier, that Black women are remixing different notions of world building and so on, that Black women are writing about Black folks in the future as the center, as integral to the promulgation of humanity. That if there are no Black people, there will be no people. Nope. If there are no Black women, there will be no people. Right. There'll be no culture. And also that Black women write about the future without making ourselves martyrs, right? That we're agents at the center. right? We're gods, we're goddesses, we're mothers, we're not mothers, we're all types of different figures. So I look at the android, the shapeshifter, the goddess, and the vampire as 4 key figures that I see Black women returning to again and again. And I hope in coining the term Afrofuturist feminism that I'm just one person writing about the intersection of futurity and feminism. Obviously, there are many others who do, but in that sort of specific way. So, and when I'm in conversation with folks, I mean, like you said earlier, maybe a few years ago, there were not as many people to cite. I mean, feminism, Black feminism goes long and deep, right? But specifically looking at speculative fiction in this way, it's unabashed way, it's a bit more recent, right? So I'm very much heartened by that. And so we take our role like as co-editors of this series, or as folks who are tenured, who are bringing folks on, or just people living in areas where there are vibrant speculative communities, like encourage. When I mentor young people, I'm always finding nerdy Black women. I'm like, oh, yeah, like that girl that you need to call. Remember that student I told you about, John? Anyway, who wants to be a graphic artist. And I'm like, I know some folks. And so I told her about the book, about Kindred, the graphic novel. And she's like, there's a graphic novel about Octavia Butler? Yeah, girl. And one day you can grow up and you can make your own graphic novels. How about that? So it's the academic work, but it's also sort of the individual work as well. So.
And so so the first thing is, I want to read that book right now. Can I have
to work on it?
Okay,
I'm working on it.
Yes, and also I had to remind me to ask you something about that later too.
Okay.
So
essays in my book this fall.
It is.
Yes.
Read it. Afrofuturist feminist. Was it on Book of Martha?
Yeah, on Octavia Butler's little known short story.
Yes. Oh yes. So to your question really quickly, a lot of my interest in Vodun started from me and Damian Duffy's graphic novel we put out in 2008 called The Whole Consumer Culture, that was looking at constructions of African diasporic religion as like through the lens of popular media, like American popular media. And then once we started looking at it, we realized that we didn't know a damn thing about the religion. We were victims of like the kind of like demonization and the stereotyping of those religions, right? And so the more that we started doing research, the more we realized like this is actually an extremely complex system that likens itself to like computer coding, or likens itself to these different types of systemic issues that shift current, a great deal. So the actual hero for that book was Papa Legba. So we were very much influenced by Mumbo Jumbo, by Ishmael Reed. And where the main protagonist is, an extrapolation of, Elegua or, Papa Legba. And so and also the antagonist is also Papa Legba, but a manifestation of a capitalist version of him. He's called White Peter, and he's actually the Loa of capitalism. And this is before I actually like read New Gods, because everybody would read it and say, not New Gods, American Gods, which is on television right now. This is before we went. So they were like, this is like American Gods. I was like, I don't know what that is. So to answer your question, not at the time, but after I read it, I realized that we were, everybody was kind of channeling something, right? So that book is actually out. And to answer your question about the Bokor assassin and these particular strands, so all of us have different lenses at looking at Afrofuturist culture, Black speculative culture, the Afro-surreal, what I call the ethnogothic, because we're not satisfied with just Afrofuturism as a cultural production mechanism, not exactly, right? So we started thinking about stuff like Cybertrap, which is why I was here working with the archive and working in the space, right? But also there's this thing that I kind of postulated called conjure punk, looking at hoodoo and different types of diasporic folklore practice or religious practices as a type of technology, right? So when you start thinking about it as a technology, then you start bringing in people, say like Nalo Hopkinson's practices, right? Or you start thinking about what happens when you juxtapose these kind of ancient or ancestral technologies with the modern or science fiction spaces, right? So the Bokor assassin basically he's kind of a manifestation of that, and so is Green Jack too, because he's like a lord that deals with corporations encroaching on Papa Bois, So he basically is Papa Bois, who is like the Lord, he's a spirit of the forest, right? And so he becomes like an enforcer that actually destroys corporations by turning everyone who works for them into plants and balancing out the life force. So these are things that we're dealing with as far as storytelling as ways of methods of resistance as well. So, but we should talk more about all of this actually, so, because we got to shut it down. So, but thank you for your question.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, the best.
It's been an incredible panel. Thank you for pulling this together.
Thank you
Oh.
for letting us use the space.
And if you want to talk and ask questions, I wanted to make sure we save some time for individual back and forth. And so we have at least 10 more minutes where you can actually do that. Thank you so much again. It's been amazing.